through this talk, I can tell you about kind of how I got to this point, what we're doing in the space, and how it interplays with energy. And I'll kind of go through, in the order of the presentation is really start off at the beginning, kind of talking to the technical aspects of Bitcoin. And I'm not a technical guy. I've worked with engineers and scientists my whole career, so I'll do my best to try to describe it as simply and concise as I can. Some people have varying levels of understanding of Bitcoin. So for some of you, this may just be stuff that you already know. For other people, it may be something that you've never heard before. So I'll try to talk about the technical aspects and then break it down in layman's terms. And then the middle part of the presentation is kind of about energy and why I think it's important. And then the last part of the presentation is kind of around some of the FUD, the fear, uncertainty, and doubt around Bitcoin, and then why I think the case for Bitcoin. And then I'll just touch briefly on like what our company does, Ancova Digital, which is our Bitcoin platform. So, and then do questions. I'd love to do some questions, so I'll try to finish early. So Bitcoin 101, Bitcoin, and this is taken directly from the white paper, so this slide, and the white paper was written by Satoshi Nakamoto, who is the inventor or inventors of Bitcoin, who are an anonymous person or persons. And this is part of the very first paragraph. So I'll read through this and then I'll break it down in kind of layman's terms. But Bitcoin is a purely peer-to-peer electronic cash system that allows online payments to be sent directly from one party to another without going through a financial institution or trusted third party. The Bitcoin network timestamps these transactions by hashing them into an ongoing blockchain of hash-based proof of work, forming a record that cannot be changed without redoing the proof of work. And the longest chain, or the longest ledger, which is basically what the blockchain is, serves as the proof of the sequence of events that have been witnessed. And the longest chain comes from the blocks that show that they have the proof of work, which is the CPU power. The messages are then transmitted across the blockchain, and every node on the chain validates that each block has that proof, and that effectively forms what the Bitcoin network is. And so another key thing to remember is that whenever a block is formed and the proof of work is done, you get a reward, which is Bitcoin. Only 21 million Bitcoins will ever be created on the network. So, first time I heard that, I kind of glazed over reading the white paper. I was like, okay, cool. This is like internet money that you can send back and forth to each other. This is kind of neat. I didn't really think through the ramifications and the implications of what something that was truly peer-to-peer that didn't have a trusted third party, because there's really nothing like that we have. And so for me, it took a while to really think through that, just because, again, there's nothing that we experience day to day. Even if you use Venmo, it feels like you're sending money from some person to another person, but there is just this huge stack in between of financial institutions and all these things going on. Or for example, when you use your Apple Pay at the store, it doesn't just settle right then. In fact, sometimes settlement of that payment can happen weeks later. So there's this big kind of cumbersome system in the financial network. And with Bitcoin, it is literally peer-to-peer with zero trust or zero institutions in the middle. And so I'll talk about later why that's a big deal, but it took me a while for that kind of to click. So the way that the network works, and I'll try to just explain this simply, effectively, there are transactions. So I trade a Bitcoin to you, you trade a Bitcoin to me. We then that transaction gets broadcasted across nodes, which are effectively small computers that people can run, individuals. Like I run a node at my house. I don't get any money or get anything from that other than there's some privacy things that's nice about running a node. But each node effectively contains the entire blockchain. So every time a new block is added, it gets broadcasted to the network. It stores it on that node. And nodes can do different things, and I could talk a lot about it. But effectively, each one of these nodes is like a small computer with a hard drive. The miners, which are these powerful computers called ASICs, are processing these transactions and batching them into these blocks. And a new block is created roughly every 10 minutes. And so not only are the miners processing the transactions, they are solving a cryptographic puzzle effectively. So think of it like I don't know if anybody's watched Harry Potter. I've seen it some. I think the game is called Quidditch, where they fly around, they try to catch the golden snitch. And if they catch this elusive thing that flies around, then the game is over and you win. And that's kind of how it is with these blocks. Like if they can solve the puzzle and show that they did the work, they then can stamp that block with the proof. So when they broadcast it to the network, everybody on the network can trust that this is a valid block. So there really doesn't have to be anybody saying this is true, this is false. Because of the proof that it is a valid block. And so once it shows that it's valid, once they solve the puzzle, they broadcast it to the network. It's then validated, and then the process repeats, and you add blocks to the blockchain. And it's effectively just a giant ledger, which is essentially every transaction back to the very first block. And so it's just a record of all of it. Like I said, every 10 minutes is the target time to create a block. If it's happening faster than 10 minutes, so if it's happening in 9 minutes and 50 seconds, then that means more computing power has been added to the network. If it's going slower, so it's 10 minutes and 30 seconds, that means computing power has been taken away from the network. So roughly every 2 weeks, the network will recalibrate and try to target that 10-minute interval. And so what that means is it'll either get harder or easier to mine for the blocks. And so each time, again, when the miner finds the puzzle, they get rewarded with Bitcoin. And so there's this natural incentive system to expend the computing power, expend the energy, and then get the reward of Bitcoin coming back to you. And so we'll kind of move on. So there was a problem in computing when it came to systems, and this is a problem that people thought couldn't be solved for, I think, decades, basically going back to when the first networks were being created. And it was called the Byzantine's general problem. And essentially what it was that how can you have a network where you don't need a trusted intermediary or a centralized figure that's validating what is true, what is false on this network? And the analogy was you've got 4 generals or some group of generals. They're all different, nations, and they've banded together to attack a single foe. And so the only way that they communicate is by sending messages to each other. And so how do you know that message is valid? If 3 of the generals are saying attack and one of the generals is saying retreat, and that general is a traitor or a bad actor, how can we validate whether it's true, whether it's false? And so there has to be some kind of proof that that is a true message. And this is the problem that you faced with networks. So if it's like your Visa, it's easy to figure out whether these transactions are true or false because your Visa and you house everything in a centralized database and you control it, and your systems engineers and software engineers have put it all together. So you kind of know, hey, is this in our system or isn't it? If it's a distributed system like Bitcoin, you've got independent actors all around the world that are processing these transactions, that are sending Bitcoin back and forth, that are mining for Bitcoin. How do you find a way to make it to where you don't have to have somebody who's the gatekeeper? And proof of work, this idea of proving that the message was true, was really the invention. Proof of work coupled with the difficulty adjustment was really what solved this Byzantine's general problem, which many people thought couldn't be solved. And so this is kind of important to think about when you think about the energy consumption and why it's doing what it's doing. And so Bitcoin is just this kind of incredible network that has never been hacked. It's never really been materially compromised. It's been going for 13 years strong. I think it was 13 years. This October 31st was the 13th year since Bitcoin launched. And proof of work has really been at the heart of why this network is so resilient, why it is so anti-fragile. And if you think about it again, I'll break it down. So the process goes where you have to use this electricity and apply this computing power to guess the answer to the puzzle, right? The more energy that the Bitcoin network uses, the stronger the network is, the harder it would be to compromise this network. The Bitcoin network benefits also because it has got the network effect. It's been doing it for 13 years. So people, and we'll talk about all the questions for Bitcoin later, people say, well, why can't there just be another Bitcoin? Well, there is millions of these computers around the world hashing, and hashing is basically solving these calculations, and it's some crazy number. It's like every second there's more hashes than there are like stars in the visible sky. I mean, it's like there's just an insane amount of computing power going into this network. And so the more energy that's expended, the more secure the network is, the more anti-fragile it is, and the more resilient. And so it would basically take just a monumental effort to compromise the Bitcoin network. Again, it's never happened. A lot of people have tried. In fact, there's tons of people every day that would love to try to do something to hurt Bitcoin. But compromising the blockchain would not only be very costly, it would just be unprofitable. So the amount of computing power that you'd have to put towards compromising the network would be far more expensive than just mining the blocks and getting the Bitcoin reward. So you're incentivized. Not only would it be very hard and almost just logistically, I don't want to say it's impossible because nothing's impossible, but not only would it be a huge logistical undertaking, it would be very unprofitable to do so. And so it's not just the energy consumption. When you first think about proof of work and finding out how to have that proof to show that your block is valid, it is the logistics, it's the manpower, it's the technical expertise. As a company that is mining Bitcoin, it is literally hundreds, if not thousands of hours of thought and prep and effort, as well as massive physical infrastructure that goes into the proof of work. So it's not just as simple as I could just expend more energy than them. There's a ton of stuff that goes into proof of work. And so this cartoon, I kind of like it. Basically, just read through it real quick. It says that if everybody's working on block 91 in the network, and one miner wants to go back and change block 74, he would have to make changes and redo all the blocks between 74 and 90, as well as change the block 91. So that's 18 blocks worth of computing power. And the kicker is he would have to do all of that before the people at block 91 solve for that block. So if you can imagine, it's just the higher or the more stacked up the blockchain is, the more difficult it would be for someone to go back in and compromise historical transactions. And so this is just a cool way to visualize it. And so that's basically in a nutshell. And for me, like, I've spent my whole career kind of at this intersection between energy and value and monetizing energy. And so, like, I had to understand this part of it before I really got Bitcoin, because people were coming to us and saying, you can take energy, whether that's stranded energy like natural gas that didn't have a sales market that was being flared, or whether it's grid energy that's being wasted, and you can otherwise monetize that energy into a much higher value. And for somebody that spent a career kind of, duking it out to make 10-cent margin on natural gas. So for example, nat gas trades at like $4 today. So, if you could find 10 extra cents somewhere in that value chain, that was a huge deal. You could make people millions of dollars for just that little bit of value. And so we built a whole business around this. And when I found out that you could sell natural gas and effectively equate it to $35 per MCF, which is roughly where it's at today, I think it may be a little lower, around $30 per MCF. It was like a earth-shattering, like I couldn't sleep for 2 or 3 days type of moment, because I just thought this just can't be real. This has to be something that's fake, or my entire career and everything I've worked on doing is going to change. And so I had to dig into this and understand why it was expending the energy for me to really get excited or get on board with actually pursuing or going down the path of doing things in the Bitcoin space. And so that's why I started with proof of work and trying to just tell you about the basics of the network. It's kind of the secret sauce, and it's what makes it be able to be decentralized. And so kind of moving on, Bitcoin's energy usage is also something that it's often attacked for, right? And so hopefully you can understand that it is because the energy usage is what makes Bitcoin Bitcoin. It's why we can have this trustless system. It's the proof of work. It's how we can prove that these transactions are real. And so you see all these people attacking Bitcoin, saying it's going to boil the oceans and that it's accelerating climate change and all these things. And I actually think Bitcoin's energy use is a good thing. And again, this has taken me some time to wrap my head around, but it's the first time in really human history that we have a large scale use of energy that is effectively agnostic to location. So Bitcoin, when you mine it, it is a very small broadband in terms of what it takes to send the signal to the network. So you can use a cell phone modem, you can use a satellite modem, and you can effectively put the Bitcoin mining anywhere. And so again, when you first hear this, you're like, okay, that's fine. You can stick a mine wherever, back behind whatever it is, and plug it in. But when you think about it, and you think about energy, like I have my whole career, all of energy is effectively this game between getting supply to demand. So this microphone is plugged in here. It runs through a cord that's plugged into the wall. You can trace this with a physical object. You can trace this all the way back to a literal source of energy. There is probably a natural gas well or a coal power plant or a windmill or solar panel somewhere in the earth that is far away from here, probably relatively far away, that you have to physically trace that energy to get it to this microphone or to this computer. And so this idea of being able to take large scale demand for energy and move it anywhere to where there's supply is, again, there's just never been anything like that. And not only is it a large scale demand for energy, it is also today, currently at the Bitcoin price and the hash price for the network, it is the highest value use case for energy. So like I mentioned, the natural gas, what I talked about with natural gas, like even retail power is probably at my house, it's around 9 to 11 cents per kilowatt hour. Right now, mining Bitcoin, depending on how powerful your ASIC computer is, you can get potentially in excess of 30 to 40 cents for that energy. So it is, not only can you move it anywhere, it's the highest value use case. And so then you look at all the applications for this technology and you start to extrapolate it. There's just so many things it can do. So for in our industry, you have what we call flared gas or wasted natural gas. So if you drill an oil well, there is natural gas that's a byproduct of that well. And a lot of times, if there's just not an access to a pipeline, like you can drive a truck and pick up oil, but you have to pipe natural gas. So if it's in a remote area, they just burn the gas off and flare it. And so this is, number one, is wasteful. Number two, methane escapes from the flare, which is a very high CO2 gas, and it's worse than CO2. It's a very high greenhouse gas. And so we can go directly to those wells that are flaring. We can capture that natural gas, convert it to electricity with a generator on site, and power a mobile data center that can then power this network that people are using as this new monetary network to trade value around the world. And so that's one use case that is not only has a great like ESG and environmental angle, but it's also just really cool, right? You can go and capture something that would otherwise be wasted. And there's lots of examples of this. For example, hydro-powered energy, renewables. I mean, the thing about renewables is that they don't work when you need them. They work when they work, right? So when the sun's shining or when the water's flowing or when the wind is blowing. And so there's lots of times when the power, the energy that renewables are creating doesn't match up to when we need to use it, right? The demand ebbs and flows. And so you can put Bitcoin and use it as almost like a digital battery or a virtual power plant where you can locate it at these sites. And so, for example, like Texas, where you've got this grid that during certain times, like if the wind stops blowing because it's really hot, they getting forced to have brownouts and even blackouts. And so if you could have a large scale source of demand like Bitcoin mining that could underpin additional base load, so you could say we could build a new power plant or we could build 3 new power plants, and when we don't need them, we'll be mining Bitcoin, which, by the way, converts this to a much higher value that you can store forever, has no shelf life. You can send it through space and time at the speed of light anywhere in the world and transfer that value to somebody else. There's just so many things you can do with it that you couldn't do with traditional energy. And then, by the way, whenever we need that energy, you can power the miners down and push it back to the grid. And now you've created effectively a battery or a virtual power plant. And so I could go on and on about the energy and how it's going to change things, but it's really just probably the most disruptive thing. And I've been in the industry for 11 years, so it's certainly the most disruptive thing I've ever seen, and something that I think has a lot of ways that can create a lot of good. One more example I'll use before I move on is how much time do I have? I've got till the end of the hour. Okay, so one other example I'll use is like you've got a lot of energy poverty in the world, right? So if you're in the Congo or somewhere in Africa, you may have a lot of natural resources. You might have oil and gas, you may have hydro, you may have access to energy. The problem is you don't have the infrastructure from a transmission standpoint to go underpin that hydro dam, because now you've got to lay transmission lines through the mountains or through the jungles to get it to all the different villages. And so if you had the ability to go to each locale or geographic area, build out a power source, and then when you can't probably use all that power source, but you can use it to mine Bitcoin, harness that value, and then what's ever left over, you can put it into the community. And if you need to turn the mining off to power more stuff in the community, you can. But it effectively acts as like an anchor tenant to support energy projects in different parts of the world where there may be energy poverty. So it sounds kind of crazy that could be something that could help energy poverty around the world, but it's already happening today. We're hearing about it in certain third world countries where people are going out at a small scale and taking energy sources and mining Bitcoin and using that as a source of revenue to help them from an economic standpoint, but then also used to power their villages and their communities. And so, again, just this idea that you can bring this really high value of energy and move it mobily around the world is it's just a thing it could change a lot of things. And so back to the total energy usage, you hear these headlines, Bitcoin uses all this energy. Like currently today, the network uses about 0.1% of the entire world's energy. So it's very small. And even if Bitcoin keeps growing at the rate that it's growing at, which it's growing at about 2 times the speed that the internet grew at from a disruption standpoint, it's pretty shocking. But even if it does, I mean, the most that we see in projections that it'll get to is still 0.1%. So this is a rounding error in the world's energy usage. It is using a lot of energy, but so does a lot of other things, right? Like clothes dryers use far more energy than the Bitcoin network. Consumer electronics use far more energy than the Bitcoin network. Hot tubs use more energy than the Bitcoin network. So the next time you read something that Bitcoin's accelerating climate change or is destroying the planet, this is just what we call FUD. It's a good headline that people like to click on it. But if you really look at it, the energy usage is not only the secret sauce and what makes this possible, it's actually a good thing for all the reasons that I mentioned earlier and what it can do in the energy markets. So talking more about the FUD, because this is what everybody likes to talk about. So you hear it all the time, like Bitcoin's the next tulip bubble. That's one that you see pop up probably every 6 months in an article. Why don't they, or the government's going to ban it. That's another one. So I'll talk on that one. I think Bitcoin as a money, and we're going to go in the next slide, we'll talk about what money is. But, the government, what you're going to see is that, number one, the government's going to tax it. They already are taxing it. You'll see governments like China that want to move to ban it and that have said that it is banned. And I think they'll probably put some regulatory framework around it. Maybe they will outright ban it forever. But people will ask me about that, and they'll say, look, China's banning it. What's stopping the U.S. from banning it? And my first response is usually, well, that's bullish, right? Because if the governments are banning it, that means it's working. It's like doing what it's supposed to do, which is creating a new form of money, which they don't like because they want to control the money system. But the other thing is that governments are going to embrace it. So look at what Texas is doing. Governor Abbott keeps coming out and talking about it. They know that they're a big energy state. They've embraced it. They want to be the Bitcoin mining capital. I think Oklahoma needs to step up. We're working on that. Senator Ted Cruz and some of the other Texas legislators have been very vocal, speaking out about it. Senator Loomis in Wyoming has come out in support of it. So I think in the world where you see places with freedom, with pro-business, with places that want to facilitate trade, I think they will embrace this technology. And then you look at a country like El Salvador, which has recently made Bitcoin legal tender in the country, and they've mandated that everybody have to take it and use it for transactions. And so, people say the government's going to ban it. Well, this year a government made it their currency. And so that's the trend that we're seeing. And we're going to see some governments that won't like it, and we're going to see others that will embrace it. And I think that's true with a lot of technology. The other one is like, why don't they just create another Bitcoin? You've got Ethereum, you've got Dogecoin, you've got whatever other meme coin that they decide to make. And a couple things. It's like, look, I could go create another Wikipedia. I could copy Wikipedia's source code, and I could go and post it. And I could pump a bunch of marketing dollars into it, right? And say, hey, everybody use my Wikipedia. Like, no one's going to use my Wikipedia. Like, it's just, there's a thing called a network effect, which people in here probably understand. But it gets back to the energy usage. Like, the Bitcoin network is so robust, and it's growing at such a rapid speed. Like, right now where the Bitcoin network is at, it's about where the internet was in 1997. And this is a stat that people throw around. I don't know if you guys have heard it, but it's growing at 2 times the speed of the internet. So where it's at today is very, very early on, and that network effect is continuing to grow. And so, the other thing about it is that, like, these other altcoins, they're trying to do something that Bitcoin's not. I would almost like equate them more to like a company or like equities. You got like Ethereum 1.0, 2.0. They got a new team of developers like Solana and all these other coins, and it's changing all the time. They're upgrading it. They're printing more, and it's like, I don't know about you guys, but like, I don't want my money to change. Like, I want my money to be the same money that I had 2 years ago. I want it to be the same money next year. I don't want like a 2.0 version of my money. I want my money to be sound money that I can store value in. And so I think that a lot of these cryptocurrencies are very, very centralized. They pretend to be decentralized because they're on a blockchain. But at the end of the day, they are controlled by a small group of people that can have massive changes to them. And even if they were totally decentralized, they don't have the powerful network effect that Bitcoin has. Now, that doesn't mean that there won't be other coins. There obviously are, and will continue to be. But I just think that long-term Bitcoin will be the gold standard, for lack of a better term. So, and we can talk about it. I want to open it up to questions, so everybody tell me why I'm wrong here at the end. So accelerating climate change, I already talked about that one. What if Bitcoin gets hacked? We talked about that. It's be very difficult to do, if not impossible. People never use it for transactions. That's another good one. It can't scale. They're starting to in places. And I mean, any new currency, like, it's going to take time for adoption. And so we're seeing things like the Lightning Network, which is a second layer solution. It sits on top of the blockchain. It effectively batches transactions, so you can do microtransactions. So you can send fractions of a penny. So I've got a buddy who has a podcast, and he can stream. He has people streaming him what are called sats, which are the smallest divisible unit of Bitcoin. So there's 100 million sats, like Satoshi's the guy that founded, like cents. It's kind of a play on the word cents, but he can get these streamed to him in real time. So this is something we could never do with dollars. I mean, Visa is going to charge you. It's the reason why you have to do a monthly subscription fee. But with Bitcoin, because it's just so costly to do these charges, but with Bitcoin, you can literally stream it in real time in tiny, tiny fractions of a penny. And so, maybe there's a future world where you don't pay for cable or for listening to music. You pay as you listen, and you pay just fractions of a penny to listen to your favorite song. And then all over, you go the whole month, and you've actually paid less than your Spotify subscription, because this technology has allowed you to create less friction with money. So I think the transactions will come as adoption picks up. Bitcoin isn't backed by anything. That's a fun one. We'll talk about what money actually is here on the next slide. It's a Ponzi scheme. People have to keep buying more of it, and it can't go up forever. And so the interesting thing about Bitcoin is that the price or the supply is totally fixed. So there's 21 million, and it is going to continue to go exponentially down in supply. Right now, about 90% of all Bitcoin that will ever be created is being created. The last 10%, the majority of that will be within this decade, and then the last 1% will be over the next 120 some odd years. So it is an incredibly scarce asset that is getting much scarcer all the time, and demand, again, is growing at 2 times the speed of the internet. So, I don't know what will happen to the price of Bitcoin. Certainly in the short term, it can drop very fast and go up very fast. But, basic supply demand models like we use for oil or for gold or for any other commodity will show you that if demand is increasing and supply is decreasing, price does one thing. It goes up over time. So again, we can argue about it, but that's been the track record. It's been on average, it's gone up about 200% compounded annually per year since inception in terms of the price. And I think we're going to continue to see quite a bit of appreciation. So 2 more slides and then I'll open it up. So what is money? Money has characteristics that we can measure. It's not just, the government prints this thing and says it has value. Money actually has characteristics. And so you can look at this list on the right. It kind of compares gold, fiat money like the US dollar, and Bitcoin. It has to be fungible, you can interchangeable, has to be non-consumable. So for example, if I'm trading you a piece of bread, well, that's going to go bad pretty quickly. And people used to trade food back in the day in the barter system. Portability, you have to be able to move it from place to place. Durability, has to be able to be durable. Divisible, Bitcoin's highly divisible. It can be divided into 100 million units. Secure, Bitcoin is, right now impossible to be hacked as long as you have your private keys. There is no computer on the planet. It would take, you'd have to run this highest power supercomputer, for millions of years or something. I don't know the exact stat, but it's be very hard to break it. Maybe quantum computers could. We could move to a more higher level of encryption if that happened. Scarcity, easily transactable, decentralized, and smart and programmable. So these are just some of the things. People have traded things like seashells, livestock. Gold, for example, is a very good proxy to Bitcoin. People say, well, what is Bitcoin backed by? Well, it's like, well, what is gold backed by? Gold is a perfect example of a completely non-government backed, totally just organic thing that became money. The reason why it became money is because it had these characteristics. It's because people need something to exchange and to store value. And so over time, humans tried a lot of different things, and they settled on gold. And the reason why they settled on it was not because some grand government conspiracy that everybody's going to use gold. They settled on it because it checked a lot of boxes. It checked all the boxes here on the right. And so, if you look at the traits that money has, there is still an element of it, which is what most people have the biggest struggle with, and that is that money is a belief system. At the end of the day, it can have all those traits, but if you don't believe in Bitcoin, you think it's a scam, you're not going to buy Bitcoin. You're not going to store your value in it. You're going to store it in dollars or gold or collectible cars or whatever you think that you like to spend your money on. So I think that from the belief system standpoint, that's the one thing that I've really seen that is been impressive with the Bitcoin community is that the people that understand the technology and that have been involved with it since it early on are very, very passionate about it. They very much believe that it is a store of value. And there is virtually, and I know a lot of these people really well in the community, and there is virtually nothing that you could say or tell them that they do not believe that this is the currency that's going to power the future. And so if you look at the belief system for the people that have studied the technology, you look at the characteristics of Bitcoin, there are a lot of people that will argue it's the best money that's ever been invented. Again, tell me why I'm wrong here at the end, but that's the reason why they say that is because of these things, right? And then the moral case for Bitcoin, and I've got about 15 minutes left, so I'm going to go. So I truly think that Bitcoin can make the world a better place. Some people that don't know anything about it say that they're like, you're crazy, it's just fake money on the internet. But I do think that having a sound monetary system and be able to store your value should be a basic human right. According to the World Bank, there are 2 billion adults that don't even have access to a checking account, don't even have any basic banking whatsoever, don't have any way to store money, any way to store value. That is a huge chunk of the population. It's also estimates show that 80% of people on Earth, which I actually would argue it might be 100% of people, either live in a country where it is state-owned or totalitarian type banking system where you don't really own that property, or you live in a place where there's double or triple digit inflation. The reason why I'd say it may be 100% is because, look at the U.S. right now. They're saying it's 6.5%. I think, I bought my truck 2 years ago, and it was around $40,000, and that same truck, same exact specs, is $75,000 right now. So you can tell me that inflation has been 6%, but I've seen my purchasing power, whether it be a house, whether it be a car, whether it be the food I buy at the grocery store, I've seen that just completely be decimated over the last 18 months. 35% of every dollar that's ever existed has been printed in the last year and a half. They're talking about printing even more. It could be close to 40% of every dollar ever in existence has been printed just recently. And it's not just this administration, it was the one before that. It's fiat. They can print as much of it as they want. And so inflation hurts poor people the most. I think that when you think about money and I'll use like my parents as an example. They worked for 30 plus years to retire, and they were very conservative with their money, like tried really hard to pay down their home, to put money away so they could retire. And if the government prints 35% of the money with the push of a button in their purchasing power, again, you can argue whether it really is 30%. I've seen certain things in my life that have gone that much inflated in the last year. But if with the push of a button you can devalue the currency by 30%, that's effectively like stealing a third of their entire career. They lost 10 years of their life in the last year of the money that they've saved. Now, luckily, they have assets like stocks and real estate and things, but not everybody has that, right? So what inflation does and what money printing does is it makes the poorest people and the people without assets, or the conservative people that don't want to put their money in stocks, it punishes them and it makes the wealthy wealthier. And you can see from the 1970s when we got off the gold standard to today, the wealth gap has exploded. And the people with assets, the more money they've printed, they've gotten richer and richer. The 1% has gotten so far ahead of everybody else, and wages just haven't kept up. And so that, all coupled with the fact that Bitcoin's censorship proof, and so this is the last point, is that we're living in a time where free speech is, I would argue, kind of under attack. I mean, whether it be in social media or mainstream media, some people may argue with me again there. I think that there's a lot of instances where we've seen personal liberties kind of attacked. And so just having a technology where you can say this is objective, nobody can mess with it, it's set in code, and it is objective truth. Like the blockchain has been validated, it's been proved through the proof of work, and there's nothing anybody can do to change it. Again, there's just nothing like that. So I think that can do a lot of good in the world. I think it can open up banking and access banking to a lot of people that don't have it. If you look at the highest areas of adoption, it's in places like Nigeria. It's one of the highest adoption areas of Bitcoin. Their government was corrupt. It was corrupt the banking system, and they've moved now to using Bitcoin as their medium of exchange. So these are all the reasons why, again, I think it has the potential to be very disruptive. If you'd have asked me in 1997 to predict Netflix or Uber or, social media, nobody in this room could have predicted it. Maybe someone could have had an idea. And so that's how I think about Bitcoin. Like, I can't tell you all the things it's going to change, but I think it's going to change pretty much everything, because money is the basis of everything we do. So our company, Ancova Digital, we are turnkey Bitcoin solutions. We're doing Bitcoin mining. We have our own mines. We help our customers mine. We do a wide variety of things. This isn't an ad for us, but just wanted to tell you about us. If anybody wants to know more, you can hit me up afterwards. And that's kind of all I got. So open it up for questions. I got about 12 minutes. If anybody's got one. Go ahead.
So, you if I don't get the terminology correct, but just making sure I understood. When you were saying earlier that energy companies can mine Bitcoin to effectively be a battery earlier, were you meaning that they were burning a higher value energy to get Bitcoin to be able to purchase a more available source of energy whenever they didn't have it for people to use?
Yeah, so the question was, for people that couldn't hear, is that how does Bitcoin kind of act like a battery? And I don't know if battery is a perfect example, but effectively they are taking energy that would otherwise be wasted and then turning that into a monetary value. So they're not going to use that energy later, but for example, you can use the value of that energy, capture that value, which then allows you to have a more robust, for example, base load. So like the power plant example, it's like if you needed to build a power plant, you need lots of base load to have things like renewables. So this big push towards renewable energy, you have to actually increase the base load a lot, because the more renewable energy you have, it's more intermittent, which causes there to be these fluctuations in the grid. And so Bitcoin could act as that stabilizer, to where that's that buyer of last resort and first resort. So whenever the wind's not blowing or whatever, you can use that energy to push towards the grid. Whenever the wind is blowing and the sun's shining, you can sop up that energy in the Bitcoin mining and store that value, and it turns it into a monetary value. And then that power plant provider can take that and use it for different things, but it makes them stronger. Does that make sense? It's not like they actually can use so it's an analogy. It's not really a battery, but
I see what you're saying.
Yeah. What else we got? Go ahead.
Do you consider Bitcoin more of an investment instrument or more of a currency?
I think it is a store of value. I think that it will over time be more of a currency. I think right now it's more of a store of value, and primarily because it's still so early. I think people see Bitcoin as and the question was, do I see it as an investment or a store of value, for people that didn't hear? But I think that today, because it's so early, people get like unit bias, right? So you look at 1 unit of Bitcoin and it's 60,000, 50,000, whatever it is today, 55,000. And then you look at 1 unit of Dogecoin, or pick a meme stock or meme coin, and it's 30 cents. I don't even know what it is. But they look at that and they say, oh, Bitcoin's already here. It's, I've missed that whole thing. It's, I'm going to go invest and this other thing that's 30 cents because you have a unit bias. But take into account all the things I talked about earlier, I think Bitcoin still has this huge running room in terms of where it goes in value. And I think that at some point the market cap will get such to where the volatility decreases pretty significantly. Probably it'll take a decade or more. And then at that point, you'll see this stable value that will march upwards slower over time. The supply, again, we're seeing these big supply shocks. So right now they have the program is there's a halving every 4 years. So every 4 years, the supply of new Bitcoin that's mined cuts in half. So you see these big supply shocks. And so you see the price of Bitcoin shoot up. And that's what happens this last halving. It went from, $3,000-$4,000 up to almost 70,000, 69,000, right? It's because the demand is growing, like I talked about. And you're seeing these big supply chunks going away every 4 years. In the future, once like 99% of it's mined, you're not going to have these big supply decreases anymore. It's going to go from, this year we have this little bit, and yeah, there'll be half as much in 4 years, but half as much will be a smaller percentage of the total. There'll be more in circulation. And I think the market cap will be bigger at that point to where it'll be more stable. So today, a lot of people view it as an investment. I view it as, I guess I would say, a store of value. I do use it as a currency, but I use it as a treasury asset, so effectively a store of value. And then I think as it stabilizes and gets a higher market cap, you don't see these crazy fluctuations. I think people will transact with it more, especially in these places where they need a good medium of exchange, right? Like in the Western world, I can open up a bank account. It's easy. I can use my Apple Pay. A lot of people just don't have that. So I think it'll be both, I guess, is probably the best answer.
What are you buying with Bitcoin?
I bought different things. I mean, certainly in the Bitcoin community, people want to use it as transactions. So like if I get my tickets to the Bitcoin 2022 conference, they give me a big discount if I buy it with Bitcoin. So I'll use it for that. I'll use it for things like, I think if you're international travel, if people take Bitcoin, it's really nice because you don't have to convert it. It's universally accepted. If somewhere accepts Bitcoin around the world, you could, like if I went to El Salvador right now, I could walk into a McDonald's and I could buy a meal with Bitcoin, just scan the QR code with my phone and it pays for it. El Salvador is not the best example because they also take dollars. But if it was another country that didn't take dollars, a lot of people don't know this, but you can't Venmo internationally, right? Like you can only do it with dollars to dollars. In fact, it's really hard to transfer money between currencies. They make it difficult and it's expensive. There's exchange rates and all these things. So I think the use case for buying stuff and using transactions is more of a worldview. And I think that it will get there as adoption rises. But today it's just still really early. So that's kind of the nice thing is that it's a uniform unit of exchange. Yes?
From a regulation standpoint, where do you kind of see that as far as adoption? Because I think that very much translates in how adoption is going to go with regulation for people's safety and how they feel.
Sure.
Even though blockchain in and of itself is a secure
Right.
kind of system. So what do you see as far as regulation and how does that lead into it?
Yeah, definitely. So the question was regulation is how does that affect adoption of Bitcoin? So there are hardcore Bitcoiners that like don't want it regulated. They're like, hey, don't mess with my money. Don't mess with this stuff. There are more moderate Bitcoiners, especially people that are like institutional investors or people that, like, for example, if you're a big endowment fund and you want to buy Bitcoin because you think it's a good store of value, like you would gold or something else, you may be afraid to do it because you're like, I don't know what they're going to do. Are they going to make it? Are they going to tax it weird? Are they going to do all these things? So I think that there is a case to be made for reasonable, transparent regulation that people know what's going to happen, right? And, for example, right now, like when we mine it, I think it's taxed really bad. They tax you when you mine it, and then they tax you again when you sell it, and it's a pain because they say it's not a currency, but they tax it like one, then they tax it like an asset later. So, but at least I know what it is, right? I don't like it, but I know how that goes. So the more adoption and the more that these bigger institutions, like the banks are all getting really involved now. You're seeing a lot of the big names starting to play in the space. ETFs are getting approved, so that's like an investment fund. And so as those things happen, there will be regulation. And I think in some ways, if it's sensible regulation, I hope that it's a good thing for people to get more comfortable and there can be more adoption, is what I would hope.
You see it as a commodity tax or a currency?
I mean, it's taxed like both kind of now. I mean, I wish. So like when I produce a barrel of oil, if it goes into a tank, we don't pay taxes on the oil until you sell the oil, right? Or gas too. You could put it into storage. If you produce a Bitcoin, you're taxed immediately as if it was dollars, right? But they say it's not a currency. The government goes out of its way to say this isn't a currency, but we're going to tax it like a currency. And then when I go to sell that Bitcoin, they tax me again as a capital gains tax. So that's why I said I wish it was like more like a commodity, I think. And I haven't thought through all the ramifications of that statement, but in my mind, from somebody who sells commodities, I would rather it be treated as I get taxed when I sell, or maybe there's some period of time like at the end of the year I got to sell it or I didn't pay. I don't know. I wish that it wasn't just taxed the way it is now, but it is what it is. So, go ahead.
What do you think about proof of stake versus proof of work? Because a lot of coins, people will say it's more efficient.
Yeah.
To have proof of stake, it's faster.
Right.
Energy conservative. What would you say?
Yeah. So the question was proof of work versus proof of stake, and I probably don't have all the time to go into what proof of stake is, but essentially proof of stake is another way that they're trying to solve the burden of proof. So how do you know that this block is valid? So right now it's proof of work, and this is what Ethereum uses as well, but there are a lot of new coins that are using what they call proof of stake. And so the solution that they came up with is that you just stake money, you stake coins, you put them in, you lock them up effectively, and then you then have to validate that the blocks are real. And if you're a bad actor, then you lose the coin that you staked, and you potentially even get kicked out of the network. So it's another kind of hammer mechanism to where basically people won't cheat because they'll be staking their coins rather than spending the energy. And so people have said this is going to be what could replace proof of work. I think the biggest problem to me, and we're seeing it through, there's a couple problems. One is that proof of stake is very complex. So a proof of work, you can, and I'm not a coder, but from what I've read, it can be coded fairly simply. It could be like 100 lines of code to do the proof of work. And whereas proof of stake, it's hundreds of thousands of lines of code. It's very complex. There's lots of backdoors and different ways it can be attacked. And so that's why Ethereum's taken so long to launch, is because they just keep coming up with ways to poke holes in it. The other thing about proof of stake is it has a and this is the big problem, is that it has a very strong centralization effect. So if you're Amazon, you decide I want to control Ethereum, which most of the nodes are hosted on AWS anyways, they could just come in and stake fiat. And what we talked about earlier is fiat is infinite, right? So if a government wanted to stake fiat, they can just print fiat and they can stake it. And now they can be the largest stakeholder on that blockchain. And proof of stake is perpetuating, it snowballs, right? So the bigger stake you have, the more of the network you control, and it snowballs over time because you can keep staking, and your stake, you get rewarded for what you staked. So if you're the guy like Apple comes in and stakes the biggest amount, now they've got the biggest snowball. Over time, that snowball is going to get bigger and bigger, and what you'll see in proof of stake is you'll see a network that is not all that decentralized. It's controlled like an oligarchy. I can't even say the word right, but yeah, oligopoly. Golly, that one's bad. It's like an oligopoly over time. Those are the arguments. I'm not an expert on proof of stake, but I've read some. Lynn Alden, I believe is her name. She has a really good article on proof of stake versus proof of work. It just came out this week. If you hit me up afterwards, I can send that to you. And she does a really good breakdown. I mean, it's probably like a 20-page article or 15-page article, and she breaks it down. And she's been a big proponent of trying to look at proof of stake, but her conclusion is effectively that it is has some centralizing effects that could be a problem over time. What else we got? Go ahead. I mean, the biggest problem that I see today in Bitcoin is that and I don't want to sound like too much of a Bitcoiner, but I think it's just the misunderstanding around it and not understanding what the technology is, and people effectively looking at it as something that they don't get it for whatever reason. I think the bear case for Bitcoin is if for some reason the proof of work mechanism were to break. So if hash power has been increasing over time as it's designed to do, which is computing power. In short-term periods, we can see computing power dip, like when there's a bear market. If we went through like a long-term, prolonged time period where hash power is continuing to dip and trending downwards, I don't think that would be good for Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin, it needs to get more computing power. It needs to get more robust, because if it's going to be a medium of global exchange, then I think it needs to have more robust network. And so if the network is getting less secure over time, I would say that would be a red flag, which we haven't seen that. The other negatives I could think of, really like a lot of the stuff, the FUD that you read, people say like they use it for crime and all that stuff. It's actually really transparent. I mean, if you ever make a Bitcoin transaction to do something illegal, like it's there forever. Like that's on the blockchain for all of eternity. Someone can track that. Far more crime is committed with US dollars than Bitcoin, like way more. And cash especially, because you can't trace it. So I don't know. What do you think? Do you have anything that specifically that you're thinking that could be a negative? Maybe I haven't thought of it. Yeah. For sure. It's a lot to think about. Yeah, yeah.
change from the currency that we are used to, like the dollar.
Right, for sure.
Over to Bitcoin.
Yeah, there could be some of that. So that definitely could be disruptive, which not be a good thing. And I'm out of time here in a second. So the last thing I'll say is that modern monetary theory people that are very big fans of inflation and kind of the existing structure, they think a deflationary currency like Bitcoin would be a bad thing. So they point back to like the Great Depression and they say that this was caused by deflation, and that they say inflation is a good thing. It stimulates jobs. It creates wage growth. In theory, it creates asset growth. And so classical economists will dog on it and say that it could have unintended consequences. So there is a bear case for it. But for the reasons I mentioned earlier about inflation, I just think that inflation is just too tempting for governments, right? Like they can just print and they can take out as much debt as they want. So I don't know. That would be probably what someone who would say that didn't like Bitcoin, they would say deflationary currencies are a negative. So I'm out of time, I think, but thank you guys. Appreciate it.